the Uranus Retrograde that is happening at 1 degrees of Gemini on the 6th, Saturday, at 12:51 a.m. Eastern Time. So because we're teetering right at the beginning of that day, you're going to want to look at your time zone because this could be happening on Friday, or it could be happening much later in the day on Saturday. We have been discussing the outer planets a lot in 2025, and that is because starting with Pluto changing signs officially in November of 2024, all of the other outer planets have been changing signs in a few month period of time. And then following that, all of them have been stationing retrograde, one after the other. And Uranus is our last holdout. Uranus represents unexpected change, surprises, as well as revolution. So it's an uprising, upheaval. Now, if you've attended my classes earlier this year, when Uranus first entered Gemini, when Neptune first entered Aries, when Saturn first entered Aries, there's a lot of associated history and energy around these particular ingresses as relates to revolution, in addition to just what Uranus represents by itself. So if you missed those classes, definitely go back on my YouTube channel. I also wrote about all of those in my blog. So if I don't have a video for it, maybe it was before I started recording these classes, you can read about it on my blog. But for Uranus and Gemini, so Gemini represents communication, teaching and learning, duality, so it's the twins, seeing all sides, maybe being a little bit of a contrarian. And whenever you have a retrograde, as I mentioned before, these are periods of healing and reflection where you're looking back, but how you look back is dictated by the planet. So when we have Uranus looking back, this tends to be associated with reflecting on the freedoms that you have. So are you free? Are you not free? What privileges, rights do you have? What are systems that are in place that are outdated? You're really taking a different look at, what's working to support people's freedoms, their autonomy, ability to make change in society. And it, on a similar note, encourages you to individuate and to innovate. So during a Uranus retrograde, you could be thinking about, how do I break out? Like, where am I trapped? Where am I in the system? And how can I do something that is different? Versus if it was just in forward motion, the change is just happening. It's like, oh, let's change this, let's change that. But when you have the retrograde, you're really stopping and you're looking around and saying, where do I need change? Where do I need to become more of an individual? Where do I need to create new opportunities for myself, or completely fundamentally change how I'm operating and what I am doing? Also associated with Uranus retrogrades on the collective level is there could be a dialing back of change. So again, change in forward motion versus change in retrograde. It could mean that some progress that was made to innovate or to support freedoms or to revise outdated structures could claw back a little bit. And I know some people might look around and say, what are you talking about? We've already had clawing back. Well, in part, that's because it happens every year. Uranus retrograde is every year for half the year. So we're either just in on or off position for these very outermost planets. So if you feel like we just had things rolling back, what are you talking about? It probably was from the last retrograde, which wouldn't have honestly been that long ago. You also could have reversals. So maybe there's something that was put in place, it gets reversed, it gets rolled back. Or there's just pushback on change. So if we're witnessing collective change, as an example, and as associated with Uranus in Gemini, protests and people speaking out, having their voice be heard. Remember, Gemini's communication. There could be pushback on certain efforts and initiatives. And also could just be reflection on, well, how has that been going? How have the efforts for the collective been going to make change? So Uranus will be retrograde from September 6th, as I mentioned, until November 7th, when it enters Taurus. So it's going to be retrograde for a while, but really this leg that we're talking about, so I will revisit this when we get there to talk about the Taurus leg, but the Uranus retrograde in Gemini leg is between September 6th and November 7th. So it's 2 months. Then it's going to be back in Taurus, still retrograding, and then going forward again, and then returning to Gemini. And that's all going to be happening end of this year, beginning of next year. So we're just talking about one segment of the retrograde for the next 2 months. So when we get there, of course, I will have another class where we'll specifically talk about the retrograde re-entering Taurus, similar to what we did with Saturn re-entering Pisces. We can expect reviewing of the innovations that we made to our communication, as an example. This could include social media. This could include AI, as well as travel, especially air. Gemini is an air sign. So planes, flights, traffic control. I know in the US this has been a big topic. And then specifically as an individual, the Gemini area of your chart. So this is where you want to pull your chart out. And really we're just talking about 0 degrees and the 1st degree of Gemini, because that's where the retrograde is happening. It's happening at 1 degree and then moving backward to 0 degrees. And then the rest is going to be in Taurus. So as you see, it's going to take 2 whole months to move from 0 to 1 to then get to 29 of Taurus. So it's 2 months to move 2 degrees. 8th house. So this means looking at fundamentally for your mental health, for how you're receiving money, for inheritance, for shared resources, for your ability to release and let go and shed. Where are you as an individual in that? Where are you making changes that support your rebirth and support your transformation? I think it's a very interesting pairing having Uranus go through the 8th house, because Uranus is okay with breaking things down and building things back up again, and that's very 8th house. So you have kind of an echoing of that. So it just, as it is moving through in direct motion, but over, the next many years as it is moving through Gemini, you kind of have this nice pairing, aligned pairing of the general premise of what they are looking to do in that area of life. So it could mean that maybe, because it's retrograde, again, this depends, it could go either way, but maybe there's some progress that you have made and maybe it slightly backslides because it needs revision. Have to do it in a little bit of a different way, like think a little bit more outside the box. That's also possible. Gemini's first house, I have natal Uranus at 29 degrees Scorpio. So it's in the orb of being opposite, but the exact opposition won't be for a bit, at least several months, because it has to get back to Taurus before it can be in the sister sign for Scorpio. So if we're looking at your first house, similar and a little different, of course, to what I was just talking to Misty about, you're reimagining who you are as an individual, but the first house is your identity. So this type of transformation, this overhaul, this, revolting, becoming a different version of yourself, it's a very transformative energy in that way. So when you have the retrograde happening, you could be going back and checking, all right, well, how do I want to maybe operate differently? Or if you want to change your appearance, like, hey, I want to like go through almost not rebirth, because I would say rebirth energy is a little bit more Pluto, but again, it's like big fundamental change and in a more sudden way than Pluto, which is much, much slower and just kind of like, let's excavate over time and then it'll be different on the other side. For Uranus, it's the unexpected change and surprises. It is the abrupt revolution. So I wouldn't say like it's impulsive because it's a slower moving planet and Mars is the most impulsive, but it's kind of the next one after that of like, let's change something. Let's fundamentally uproot this. Let's do something different. So maybe you have been making some changes in reframing your identity. And then, of course, as you back up and you go into the 12th house and you're undoing and you're soul searching and your self-reflection, maybe you've been doing some work in those areas, and it's just circling back and saying, all right, like, are we good with that? Or there's some changes that we want to make to it so that it's really aligned with the big overhaul that we need. And then on that point for Roseanne, the 12th house, so that is looking at, that is the soul searching, that is isolation, that is introspection, that is your self-undoing, ways that you self-sabotage. And maybe you are doing that in a way that is helping you to individuate or breaking down systems or have more freedoms, but you're doing the double check to make sure that the changes that you are implementing are going to serve you to feel free. Especially interesting when we're talking about a 12th house, which could feel isolated or a lot like it's associated with hospitals and prisons and like kind of being stuck, contained somewhere. So to have Uranus moving through that space is super interesting. So it's going to be, I think, pretty fascinating for you to watch in the years ahead as it's moving in direct motion through this sign, how it's undoing the systems that are like keeping you isolated or keeping you maybe feeling trapped, or ways that you are kind of inflicting on yourself in such a way. But doing a lot of shadow work, feelings of isolation, yes, absolutely. So these couple months ahead are going to be a look back at what you have been doing in this space, and then when it goes back in, you'll probably just pick back up with the shadow work. But the retrograde will give you an opportunity to really check in on the adjustments that you've been making. So then when you have round number 2, which will be many years long, you could maybe come at it with a different approach.